Okay, it's always reassuring when the PowerPoint works. So, well, thank you very much for your stamina in staying to the final sort of presentation before Mr. Howard will speak for the day. My name is Marija Taflaga. I'm from the Australian National University, and I have the difficult job of maintaining your attention at the end of the day and following on from a fantastic presentation from my colleague, Dr. Marija Beazley. So when Tom asked me to look at whether or not the government was prepared for opposition, my first reaction was, well, this is a bit of a silly question. What government in their right mind would prepare for opposition? They're trying to win an election. And so he sort of finessed the question a bit further, which was to sort of say, well, what was the impact of the absence of both John Howard and Peter Costello? And for those of you that, by some miracle, do not recall the events after 2 days of a retrospective on John Howard, we might recall that John Howard's government, after 11.5 years, ended at the end of November 2007, which was the second longest serving government in Australian political history, and it was also another sort of milestone in the sense that John Howard also lost his seat, which was again the second time that had happened to a sitting Prime Minister. Shortly after that, the sort of unexpected event in particular was that Costello chose to resign, or to refuse to accept the leadership if offered, or to put himself forward in the position as leader. And he sort of said the reason was that he wanted to pursue a post-parliamentary career and that it was time for generational change. Now this, as we sort of understood from the panel earlier today, and from reporting at the time, and frankly all of us that remember this time, was very unexpected. I think there was a sense that there would be a natural progression from John Howard to Peter Costello as opposition leader, and I'm pretty sure Nick Minchin was reported as saying that, you know, he would have been uncontested as the leader. And this sort of led to a situation which Brendan Nelson sort of spoke about a little bit earlier, which was a contest between several actors, Brendan Nelson and Malcolm Turnbull being the titular one, and also Tony Abbott, who it was during this campaign received the sort of unfortunate nickname from Annabel Crabb, which actually turned out to be very perceptive, which was People Skills Abbott, which turned out to be an important part of his actual success as an opposition leader later down the line. But anyway, the cruelties of satirical journalists. Nelson went on to win this contest, as we all know, but he was under constant pressure from Malcolm Turnbull for the entire time. And this sort of surprise at the beginning of this opposition period, where Peter Costello, the sort of safe pair of hands, an experienced pair of hands, the removal of Mr. Howard from his seat, and the resignation of a raft of really senior MPs created the sort of, perfect conditions for a set of leadership changes. Now, what I really don't want to do in this presentation is to go over the personal drama of this era. We all remember that. Instead, I actually want to ask a few more sort of systematic questions, which sometimes do involve personal drama, but we are trying to sort of get past that a bit. So what I kind of want to look at is, what was the sort of impact on the party's internal stability with the removal of these sort of heads of state? What was the impact on internal debates within the party as it tried to sort of reshape itself, particularly in this first period of opposition before the 2010 election? And what was the capacity for the organisation, that is the Liberal Party's machine and its membership, in terms of its capacity and its reform? Okay, so now, I am a political scientist, and as a result, I always like to think about what are the institutional constraints that actors are operating under. And in the case of the Liberal Party, I'll take a step back. And as someone who sort of studies parties, we like to think about it as parties having three faces. The party in elected office, that's parliamentarians. The party in central office, that's the machine. And the party on the ground. The Liberal Party actors, people in the Liberal Party like to think of it as the parliamentary wing and the organisational wing, and they collapse the machine and the membership into sort of one sphere. And I guess what's important to kind of know about the Liberal Party beyond, the fact that it's a centre-right party and so on and so forth, are, how it's structured and organised if you don't happen to know. And that is, it's a mass party. It has a mass party structure which hasn't really changed much since its inception in the early 1940s, and it's predicated on a form of social interaction that doesn't really exist today anymore. People have televisions. Political party meetings are not necessarily the entertainment that they might have been when we didn't have TV, and nor are political parties the sort of place where you might go to meet a wife or a husband. So the nature of the way people relate to political parties has really changed, despite the fact that much of the infrastructure and the organisation of the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, for that matter, hasn't changed terribly much since then. It is also a federal party, which is really important to the reality of how power is distributed in the Liberal Party. The centre is very weak. Its capacity to make the states do anything is minimal, to say the least, and fairly recent comparatively as a set of powers. It's hierarchical, as most mass party organisations are, and it is sort of, unlike the Labor Party, it gives its parliamentary party an awful lot of scope to set policy agendas and to be in charge of policy directions for strategic reasons, right? Which is probably one of the reasons why it's very successful. And if we look at the UK election and Jeremy Corbyn's Labor, we can kind of sort of see why political parties might say that might be a good strategic move to allow parliamentary actors that level of autonomy. And the final thing is that it's really leader dominant, right? The Liberal Party is, much like the British Conservatives, a party that really depends on having strong leadership, and if the leader has a lot of authority, then it has a lot of capacity to be cohesive and to act. And if it doesn't have those conditions, then it can often run into trouble. And Tom would know, having studied the 1960s, that what happens when you don't have strong, authoritative Liberal Party leaders. So given those factors, if we sort of kind of think about my sort of three themes and how the Howard government might kind of relate to them, we might consider internal party stability. Now, one of the nice things about being last is that we've had a lot of the context sort of set for me, and in some ways I was a bit disappointed that Tom didn't read us his paper, because in many ways it did sort of effectively sort of establish some of the factors that would be playing into the internal stability of the party, which is effectively the sort of leadership decisions around whether or not a transition should be made towards the end of the Howard government. And naturally, if you do lose your senior figures, that will lead to a certain amount of instability just through inexperience as political actors. But also opposition, as those of you in the room who have lived through it would know, has specific challenges that interact with a political party like the Liberal Party, which gives an awful lot of autonomy to its parliamentary actors to act and relies an awful lot on the effectiveness of its leader, okay? So there are fewer spoils to distribute as a party leader when you are the leader of the opposition, because you have fewer resources and you have fewer, jobs to hand out, to be kind of crude about it. Opposition is inherently reactive to government. Your capacity to set the agenda is fairly limited and really difficult to be able to actually be a pace setter. Further to that, especially when you've just come out of 11 and a half years of opposition, you are dealing with a grieving and disengaged team that probably doesn't really want to show up to work because they feel a great sense of powerlessness, particularly if they are in the House of Representatives, right? Because the House has significantly less capacity to make policy differences and has significantly fewer scrutiny functions than the Senate. And so, these are all recipes for internal tensions and strife. It is the worst job in politics for a reason, being opposition leader. And so given what we kind of know about the Liberal Party, given the authority it places on its leaders, which I think is best described in a lovely essay by David Kemp from 1973, where he describes the relationship between the Liberal Party as the crucial relationship being between the Liberal leader and their followers, not necessarily the Liberal leader and voters, right? We can kind of sort of see how a political party that invests an awful amount of authority in its leader and relies on a leader to sort of effectively set a policy agenda and to provide an example for a party that is in many ways a leadership vehicle, when you do not have terribly much when you get the job unexpectedly, when a lot of the people you might rely on for advice are not necessarily with you there on the chamber floor, and when your party organisation has become a sort of a victim of its own success in the sense that it's slowly sort of atrophied over time, that is putting a lot of weight and responsibility on leaders to deliver. And in opposition, they are very vulnerable. And in effect, we saw precisely the consequences of that during the first term of the opposition leadership. And to be blunt, someone asked me last night, would it have mattered if Peter Costello had been in power for an extra year, or would it have mattered if the Prime Ministership had changed earlier? Well, to sort of copy Tom, perhaps, maybe, but the reality is that without electoral success, the Liberal Party tends to be unstable. And so even with experience, it's quite possible that we would have seen leadership change and perhaps leadership turmoil, but perhaps not at quite the accelerated rate. And that takes me to my second point, which is about internal party debates, internal party policy discussions, and how that relates to the legacy of the Howard government, and it also relates quite critically to leadership instability. So, opposition is obviously a time of reappraisal and debate because it is a time where you require less discipline, and it's a natural time to sort of reassess policy directions and to sort of consider where people are going. And you sort of see books like this, The Liberals in Power, which was edited by Peter Van Onselen. And we can only imagine that with the absence of many of the sort of elder statesmen that had led the political party or their exit, that it probably allowed for a freeing up, perhaps a more robust debate than we might have seen had elder statesmen remained in power. And we sort of see an example of that in the recent Labor review, which is very gracious and kind around Bill Shorten's performance. And perhaps if he wasn't in the chamber, still in the party, that review may have been more robust. But what I guess is kind of interesting about the several debates that broke out during this first period of opposition were two that were most interesting. First was around the meaning of the loss of the election, which relates directly to the legacy of the Howard government, and the climate debate, which obviously shaped politics during that entire term, and the Liberal Party was no exception. So when the Howard government lost office in 2007, the moderates in the party were very keen to open up the reasons for the loss of the election. And so many reasons were put forward as to why the Liberal Party had lost, and they included some of the things Brendan Nelson actually mentioned, the sort of doctors' wives issues around refugees, immigration, Indigenous affairs, David Hicks, Muhammad Hanif, sort of culture war stuff, climate change. And in fact, I think George Brandis, who was probably the key figure in this debate, has a chapter in this book that sort of goes directly to understanding the Howard era at that time. And that was sort of counteracted by and was the successful argument, I would say, by the sort of alternate response, which sought to limit the scope of the reasons for the loss of the 2007 election, which sort of hung on two factors, and we heard a lot of that today as well, which was it was time, people were sick of us, they were sick of our faces, and it was work choices. And this was important as a way of sort of setting the direction for where the opposition would potentially go. It's effectively, if you think about it, opening up the scope for what will now be possible and contested within the Liberal Party. And one of the reasons why the sort of more narrow view of what the election meant is to do with the very nature of the way Mr. Howard had governed. He had governed in an extremely efficacious way. He had had an extremely long-lived government, and he'd had a really consultative leadership style, which I think Brendan Nelson's contribution earlier today really sort of illustrated. And so there are plenty of people who, for personal loyalty reasons, would be happy to argue this line, and also just for sort of common sense political reasons that you shouldn't sort of change your philosophical direction. And I guess what is really interesting about the overall development of this argument over the long term is that what we sort of have seen is, one, it was very different to the Fraser era, right, where the opposition very much kind of repudiated the Fraser legacy, and that led to a conflict over aspects of Fraser's legacy and his role in economic reform in the 1980s. But what was really interesting is that over time, particularly towards the end of the opposition period, was that John Howard has entered the Liberal Party canon, just like Robert Menzies. And what was particularly interesting to me, I suppose, is the way that Tony Abbott in particular often used the Howard government as a rhetorical touchstone to sort of remind voters what good government looked like, what the Liberal Party stood for, and its capacity to, run the economy and get on with the job, as it was. And so, so that was that sort of one set of arguments. The other was obviously climate change, and I'm not going to prosecute the climate policy wars in extensive detail, simply for the fact that I think we are all familiar with the parameters of this debate, because they still structure much of how we understand politics to this day. But I will sort of build on what Roger Beale said this morning, in the sense that in some ways climate, the failure to sort of proactively deal with putting a price on carbon during the Howard government, or coming up with a solution that would effectively provide a framework and a set of mechanisms for business to be able to sort of work out how to deal with this new sort of policy paradigm, did create a set of problems for the coalition. And part of those, and John Howard's policy position itself became a matter of debate. So, Malcolm Turnbull and his supporters used the fact that John Howard had taken an emissions trading scheme to the 2007 election as an argument for, why there should be discipline on this issue now in the party room. And those who were opposed to this argument, I think Cory Bernardi was someone who articulated this argument, sort of said, well, that was government and now we're in opposition and it's a new set of arguments. But I guess what is interesting in many ways, and I do agree with Roger in this sense that climate is unfinished business, and probably something that we haven't fully resolved in Australia, and that ultimately, whilst not having a climate policy in place before the government went into opposition meant that this became a difficult policy issue for the coalition to deal with, and one that is really difficult because dealing with the externalities of the impact on the environment is upsetting to basically a set of status quo positions about how the economy and society should function within the Liberal Party. And so that is really difficult and complex, and that's why we saw it as such a difficult and complex policy area for that party to deal with. But it also created the very conditions that have allowed the Liberal Party to return to government in 2013. And I think we're sort of seeing, we will eventually see what the long-term legacy of this policy domain from the Howard government through to the future will be. But I guess when we think about the Liberal Party and its constraints, the climate debate very much demonstrated that ultimately leadership change is the tool the Liberal Party has for dealing with really complex policy issues. If an agreement cannot be reached in a deliberative body like the Parliamentary Party Room, which is not organised on factional lines formally like Labor to force a result, then if you can't come to an accommodation, you get leadership change. The final thing that I want to talk about, and in many ways it's the one that as someone who is not a member of the Liberal Party and is standing on the outside, is most difficult for me to understand, and I'm really interested in your views on this one, is, I guess, the organisational wing's capacity, right? In the political science literature, we call this the black box, because it's something that we really find hard to observe. You know, we can observe leadership changes, we can observe public policy debates, private ones to an extent, but it's really hard for us to get at party organisations. And, you know, opposition is primarily the time when you need your party organisation, because you don't have the public service and you don't have as many of your staff and so on and so forth. And it also tends to be the time when organisational reform is considered, and that's a really difficult time to be considering it, because, you know, often it's sort of, you know, too late, or it takes too long to make these changes. And it's very difficult because your leader doesn't have very much authority. And in the Liberal Party, which is federally organised, you know, the leader's capacity to exact these changes is challenging at the best of times. But there were some interesting firsts during Mr. Howard's final term, and that was that Chris McDivitt was the first female president of the Liberal Party, and it also kind of coincided with an increase of women's candidacy as successful candidates, not only at the federal level but at the state level, across the party, ultimately plateauing at about 20%. But sort of, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Liberal Party's structure is from a different era, and many of the sort of known frailties of the Liberal Party have been canvassed in reports from even earlier than the 1980s, but, you know, the Valda report is a major landmark one, and these problems, which have been mentioned in subsequent reports, basically sort of coalesce around a declining role for members, problems with its branch structure, creeping problems or increasing problems around candidacy, or what we might call factional manoeuvrings, particularly in some states more than others, the problem of raising funds for increasingly expensive election campaigns, and one that party reviewers tend to complain about, I'm not sure everyone else agrees with this one, which is a lack of centralised powers to intervene in other divisions. I can see that one being contested. And then there's always a discussion around policy, which is a tricky issue in the sense that for many decades the Liberal Party's organisation has had a minimal role in policy making for the very reasons I outlined at the beginning, which was that it sort of handed over these functions. And so, you know, in some ways, why should successful prime ministers and political leaders consider taking on the most difficult and intractable politics that you can get, which is internal party reform? It was probably easier to get work choices up than to actually reform the Liberal Party. You know, it tends to be the actions of leaders that, you know, sort of have to take on their party and win or die fighting. But, you know, in many ways, it was given Mr. Howard's authority at the 2004, after the 2004 election win, given how high his authority was, it was perhaps a missed opportunity to sort of grasp the nettle on many of these issues, which remain issues and remain canvassed in reports that we have seen that are public and ones that are under wraps. And so that is, if we're sort of thinking about potential legacies and those that are frailties, then this might be one. And why might it matter? Well, this is data from the Australian Electoral Study. This side is satisfaction with democracy. The black line is people who are satisfied. These are the people who are unsatisfied. And more importantly, this is trust in government. And the question is, do you believe that politicians will act in their own interests against voters? I can't actually read it, it's too small. That's going up, and the number of people who disagree with that is going down. That is not just a problem of political parties. It speaks to more broadly a sort of or governance, right? Like, and this is not just about political parties, but there is a dimension of this problem that relates to how effectively political parties are able to be democratic linkages between the public and their capacity to recruit people that are able to effectively represent people. And so that is why it might matter even if the Liberal Party continues to win elections. That's it.
So, Marija, the last time we had a one-term federal government was 1931. So we always make the presumption that governments will get two goes. Does that mean that many parties who lose think, well, I've probably got 5 to 6 years to sort this out before we realistically face the people? Now, as it turned out, Labor nearly lost in 10, the Coalition nearly lost in 98, but it still hasn't happened. So do you think people are complacent? Look, if we lose, we've probably got 2 terms to sort the problems out.
Yes, I do think that most people use the past as a referent. That makes sense. That's entirely rational. And that there was a lot of discussion at the time of the 2007 election that, we'll be out of office for a decade. And so, yeah, you can kind of see why there isn't necessarily an urgency around this, and no one predicted that, well, actually, I don't know, maybe other people in this room might disagree, but, at least in terms of public discourse, no one predicted that the Labor Party would implode in the way that it did.
And do you think that of those leaders that you showed there after 2007, none of them had an experience of opposition? If being in opposition is being different to being in government, and you have to learn to be in opposition, none of them had any experience. So therefore, is it almost inevitable that the first years, after a long reign like Labor had, they didn't do too badly between, I think, 96 and 99. But do you think just almost the coalition needed time to get experience of opposition to be better at it? I'm trying to avoid the idea it just descended into psycho-warfare.
Oh, right, okay. That is a really complex question. So I mean, actually what is important about the opposition, the coalition opposition between 2007 and 2013 is that actually really important actors in the success of returning to government had experience of opposition in the 90s. So Tony Abbott had worked for John Hewson and then had obviously entered Parliament in 1994, and of course Andrew Robb, who'd been federal director, who was quite central to giving ballast to the coalition in opposition, particularly after Turnbull became, well, actually essentially after Abbott became leader. So yeah, I do think that being in opposition is good training, and I think Mr. Howard has sort of reflected on the fact that he learnt a lot from being in opposition, and that changed the way he acted as a leader. So I think that's answered your question.
Well, he says that he was better the second time because he worked out the things that were bad the first time. In other words, it's almost like learning from failure or finding success in defeat. And I wonder whether or not there was that absence of that. So people could have the experience of being in the party machine or being an advisor in opposition, but it's not then in a senior leadership position in opposition to hold people together. I just remember a few parliamentarians saying to me, don't go the other side, the opposition, you'll join them soon enough, and if you've not been there, it's a cold and desolate place.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, I understand your question now. So there are two things. We know political careers are generally getting shorter in Australia. So people are entering office and leaving office a lot quicker than they used to. Part of that is to do with just changing natures of career paths, and also, politics isn't the vocation that it might have been in the 40s. And another kind of aspect to that is... trying to think how to say this. Whether or not you need experience of opposition, well, Australia is actually quite an outlier. Britain's probably the only one that's more extreme, where we don't have very good alternation between government and opposition. We have really long-lived governments. Generally speaking, we are currently in a period of shorter governments. The 60s is another period, but that does mean that oppositions do really de-skill over time, and so they often become very inexperienced governments, and the Whitlam government is the classic example of precisely that problem. But there remain a lot of continuities between the Howard government and the current government, and that isn't just the points that Marija made about the role of staff, but also that there were particularly in the sort of shadow cabinet, people who had gained ministerial experience in that government.
Thank you. Graham Morris.
Marija, do you think on balance that the party organisation is broken, or at least slightly wounded? But if you were running the show, what would be a couple of things you would change?
I knew you'd ask me this question, Graham. So that's a PhD. But do I think the party machine is broken? I actually think that parties are in trouble. I don't think it's exclusive to any one party, and that is, I guess, for many of the reasons I sort of said at the beginning about the fact that the way people relate to political parties is very different now. So in terms of some of the things that could be done to improve participation in parties, some of them are on the more conservative end and some are quite radical. So I'll give you the conservative ones first, and there has been some experimentation within the Liberal Party around primaries, for example. You could look at models where party members get a say in the leadership vote like they do in the UK, being very careful about the design of how you allow parties to elect the leader, you know, because you could end up with a Jeremy Corbyn situation. All of these things tend to involve giving actors who have power to give up power. And given the way the Liberal Party strategically gives the parliamentary party an awful lot of scope, you know, apart from candidate selection and perhaps leader selection, that might be quite it might be quite difficult to expand other opportunities for people to be involved in policy making, which is one of the reasons why people join parties, without really rethinking how the Liberal Party operates. So there's sort of like all things that happen at the party level, incentives within parties. I mean, a radical set of solutions, which, you know, I imagine that many people in this room would not be interested in at all, is to actually think about more broadly thinking about how to get people into politics, which isn't necessarily good for the current political parties. And that would be things like massively expanding the size of the lower house, which would increase the size of the Senate too, and potentially doing things like, which would loosen party discipline, so you'd have more people who would get into politics, you would potentially have backbench revolts, you'd have more capacity for more people to sort of influence party policy. You can sort of see why people wouldn't be too excited about this kind of a change. And even more radical still, you could sort of think about, you know, very radical models like sortition, which is basically you randomly select people from the population, a portion of them, and you put them in Parliament for, you know, 3 to 6 years. You want a lot of them, so they're normally distributed because you will get extremes. And that is a way to bring people into politics, but not necessarily through parties. So there are many options out there, and it really depends on what your outcome is, and it depends on what your goal is.
In a nation of non-joiners, it's a real thing for the future. And a final question from Jerry Wheeler.
I'm sorry if this is more of a comment. One of the many preconditions for successful Liberal Prime Ministership is the support of the lay organisation. And I think one of Mr Howard's great successes is that throughout his leadership, he maintained at all times the support of the Liberal Party, the ordinary member of the Liberal Party. They welcomed his return to the leadership in '95, and they stayed with him from that date. You know, they were part of his '96 victory, and through the difficult times of, you know, mid 2001 and early 2004, and even through 2007, they were with him. And it's because he understood them. He was a creature of the Liberal Party, and he valued their input. And he had a level of support within the Liberal Party that no leader of the Liberal Party has had since. And, you know, it's perhaps one of the things that Scott Morrison now has that he's the likes of, you know, Brendan and Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull didn't have, was the full support of the Liberal Party.
Well, I think you've articulated David Kemp's conception of the core relationship is between the leader and its followers, and why that is so important to the Liberal Party. And I guess the flip side of that is, you know, Liberal Party history is riddled with incidences where local MPs have been replaced by someone else in contested pre-selections of sitting members, and often the reason given is the member stopped explaining themselves to their constituents. They stopped attending. They stopped participating. So I guess what I'm sort of saying is that party membership in this country is really tiny. Like people who are party members are outliers compared to the general population. It's really important. You can't achieve anything without your supporters. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the way that political parties in the past, and particularly Menzies' political party, the capacity for that link of communication from the Prime Minister through to a minister, through to the local MP, through to a party member, and then all of their friends and family, that capacity to communicate, that has been broken. That chain hasn't been there for many decades. And so that is the distinction I'm trying to make.
Marija, your energy and enthusiasm for the task has lifted my flagging spirits, of which I was responsible for boring myself. But can I say it's a great way for us to almost bring to a climax our gathering. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for your thoughts, and please thank you.